I want to talk about memory and the design implications as we're working on our training and development programs. There are three different types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. And I want to talk about each one, give a bit of a description, and then talk about what it means in terms of how we approach adult education and learning. So sensory is the first layer of memory, let's say, and it's the first filter that we have. What it does is it tunes out things that we don't need to be aware of, and then we don't even notice them. So as an example, as I'm recording this, I'm aware all of a sudden that my computer is humming. Normally my sensory memory, I'm not even noticing that, it doesn't even penetrate. But I think because I'm recording and my microphone's right here, I've tuned into it. So sensory is information even getting passed into your memory. The design implications of that are we want to balance both being consistent with our design, but not boring. So we want to be consistent in terms of, let's say it's e-learning, in terms of where we have the navigation on the screen. So we always click on the bottom right to advance and maybe click on the bottom left to back up. So by having that consistency, we don't have cognitive overload. But if it's too consistent, then it'll become bland and we won't even sense that there's a difference. And we don't want to have habituation, is what it's called, where we're not even noticing something. So we need to have that balance, walk that tightrope carefully. Short-term is the second type of memory, and this is where we remember something long enough to take action. So if I think back to my university days, lots of people, myself included, would cram for a test. We'd keep it in our short-term memory, we'd write the test or the exam, and then we'd forget about it. That's short-term memory. And studies have shown that our capacity to hold things in our memory is 7 plus or minus. So all that cramming, I was probably trying to put in far too much, but there we go, 7 plus or minus. So if we can only hold 7 things in our short-term memory, how do we increase our capacity? And there we can look at things like how we chunk content. So if you're reading a recipe and it has all these steps or all these numbers, if it's a series of numbers, it's harder to remember them. But if we can chunk that recipe into what you do with the wet ingredients, what you do with the dry ingredients, and then how you bake it, that's a lot easier. Or if you take those series of numbers and let's say it's a telephone number, you structure it in the common telephone number format, and then it's easier to remember. So however we chunk the material will help us keep it in our short-term memory for longer. And then our long-term memory, this is when we encode the information and we keep it for long-term storage, obviously. And I've been reading Julie Dirkson's book here, Design for How People Learn. It's a bit of an older book, but it's great. And she uses a wonderful analogy of your long-term memory being like a closet. And what you do when you have something pass from short-term memory and you encode it into long-term memory, it's like you're putting it on different shelves in your closet or different drawers. And the key to long-term memory is to remember which drawer did I put that piece of information in so that you can retrieve it afterwards. So that's really where the learning part comes in with long-term memory, is how can I help the person encode it, and also how can I help them retrieve it so that they can use it again over and over. So part of the encoding process that we can help with is we can make sure that the training is in context. So if I'm learning CPR, for example, and I'm learning it just kind of in my house, maybe I'm doing it virtually, it's completely out of context. Whereas I remember really learning CPR on a swimming pool as part of my swimming lessons. That at least has a bit of context. That might be a place where I would need to do CPR. So if I'm learning about, if I'm a machinist and I'm learning about how to repair a machine on a factory floor, if I'm doing that in a classroom, it's removed from the context and it makes it harder for me to then retrieve those steps that I need to be able to remember and use. The other thing we can do from a design perspective is we can make the experience a little bit emotional. So not in a bad way, but if we can tell a story, that's a really common way of something being emotional. So if I can tell a story about CPR that illustrates the steps, then it'll be shelved differently in our closets, and it'll be easier to remember because there's an emotional shelf, and it'll be stored there as well as the CPR shelf. And then lastly, what we can do is we can help our learners retrieve the information. So So we do that through quizzes and knowledge checks and things like that. And the key there is, if you've already covered material, let's say it's the next module or the next day, try to avoid recapping that same material, and instead ask questions about it, because learners already encoded it the first day. You don't need to help them re-encode it. What you need to help them do is retrieve that information. So asking questions will help them go back into their closets to pull out that information. And that retrieval process is an important part of learning and making sure that it's going to actually stick. So I hope that explanation helps of those three different types of memory and what that means from a design perspective.